In this sermon, I'll be focusing on the relevance of light on one's journey to reunion with God. A corrupted version of this knowledge has been spread through New Age propaganda as the chakra system, which encourages the raising of the kundalini snake from the root of the body up to the celestial heavens of the crown, but we do not practice snake worship or possession by reptoids here at the Church of Immortality. So may this sermon serve as a bold reclamation of the knowledge of the rainbow from the deceptive serpent. Our universe is comprised of sound and light, and this is biblical. Sound. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Light. This is the message we have heard from Him and declare to you. God is light. In God there is no darkness at all. If we claim to have fellowship with God and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth. Light and sound are made apparent to us here in the physical realm by waveforms. Waveforms are oscillations of energy across time and space. Without the medium of time or space, the waveform would have nothing to travel through. So without space, a waveform could not oscillate up or down, and without time, a waveform could not have a duration and progress forward. Space and time are the definitive parameters of our physical world. So waveforms carry information through our world. And I will mention very quickly that light does not need a medium to travel through, and sound does. So sound is a feature strictly of the material world, and light is a feature that exists beyond the material world. This is why Jesus is called the Word and was made manifest tangibly, physically into the material world as an aspect of God, whereas God the Father or Source is light that exists outside of this material world. The frequency of a waveform's oscillation, meaning its up and down movements, determines how much surface area the waveform has within a defined segment of time and space. The higher the waveform's frequency, the greater its surface area, which means the more units of information or light it can carry across time and space. The lower the frequency, the lower its surface area, and the fewer units of information it can carry across time and space. So I made this illustration. So in this illustration, I've represented light or units of information with these little dots. So the higher the frequency, the faster a waveform oscillates, the more surface area there is for information to be carried, but the slower the frequency, the fewer particles of information can be carried. And so this is less light, this is more light. No light is death, the most light is God. This is why a flat line is called such. Without any sort of movement or vibration, energy is inert. It is unconscious, it is dead. No information means no light is being carried across time-space. So flat line is death. Flat line is the lowest grade of energy. The highest point of all is God, who oscillates so quickly that he appears to be completely still. And this is why in photonics, which is the study of light, light is said to have the qualities of both a particle and a waveform. The particle, or bindu, is the manifestation of the utmost concentration of consciousness. This is why God says of himself, I am. So the I am point, the one light of pure consciousness, is at the top, and the flat line of darkness, which is the total absence of light, the absence of consciousness, death, is at the bottom. And in between, we have a spectrum of high to low vibrations. Humans operate within this in-between place called the visible light spectrum. So I've made a different illustration to show you how that looks. Here's the flat line. Here's the monad or point or God. Actually, I made it really small. There we go. And here we have the rainbow from infrared downward to ultraviolet and upward, to put it very simply. So when you see illustrations of the chakra system where red is associated with the root of the body and purple is associated with the top or crown, there is a great deal of truth to this framework, but as I said, the New Age often mixes truth with lies, and so we must be discerning when parsing through this information. So invisible light extends above us from ultraviolet upward and below us from infrared downward. For simplicity's sake, we can generally say that from yellow to red are the things of the world, and from blue to violet are the things of heaven. Green, or the heart, is the bridge between heaven and earth, which is why Jesus emphasized love so much in his ministry of bringing heaven to earth. This would be the center through which we accomplish that endeavor. The highest aspiration of the human being is reunification with God. So to reunify with God, who is higher than us, is to make an ongoing practice of pointing your conscious awareness upwards towards heaven and the things of heaven. Everything you hear about God being above and heaven being up is true. Intuitively, you know that death is down and up is life. Things that are dead, they go into the ground and flatline. Things that are alive stay in motion, vibrating within the visible light spectrum, and the things that are most alive leave the ground altogether. They remain in a state of flight or light and ascend out of this realm, instead of re-entering the reincarnation cycle through the gateway of physical death. Basically, reality stratifies itself in accordance with your state of consciousness and how much light you have the capacity to perceive. And your state of consciousness is made manifest by what we call the colors of the rainbow. Each color segment in the visible light spectrum has its own associated activities, symbols, feelings, and qualities. And your capacity to perceive the light of God determines which wavelength you're on, so to speak, and you can discern which wavelength you're on by the symbols and activities you are inclined towards. The ultimate culmination of consciousness along the ascension path is called the light body, the incorruptible body, the perfected body, etc. So let's start by understanding what black is, which is infrared and everything beneath that is imperceptible to us. Black or darkness is the absence of light or God. This flatline realm is two-dimensional, and this is why dead bodies lie down flat. This is why we sleep lying down flat. Flatline equals unconsciousness, where you are not participating in the world of the living. Remember in the Garden of Eden, God cursed the serpent to crawl on its belly on the ground, insinuating that the serpent did not always crawl. The serpent may have once walked around or possibly even flown like a dragon. God sentencing the serpent to a state of being flatlined was the serpent's punishment for deceiving Eve. To be deceptive and to be deceived is to lack the light of God's truth. This is why deception or illusion is strongly associated with darkness. There's also much to be said about black screens, like computers, phones, and other black mirror devices, which are two-dimensional and lend themselves to passive psychological takeover or possession by the forces of darkness, who we call demons. And just a key thing to remember is that there are wavelengths below red in this realm that we can't see. So as I said in the previous sermon, there are degrees of death. Something can be just above dead, something can be totally dead, but I'm going to go ahead and skip to red for the sake of this presentation. So red is the color closest to the bottom of the human frequency range. So if you've ever intuitively sensed that there was something off and weird about the aggressive proliferation of gay pride flags everywhere, it's because that flag is a reversal current that erroneously places red at the highest level and purple at the bottom, thereby exalting lower, slower frequencies associated with the untamed animal nature and putting God beneath everything else. Red is the lowest form of consciousness for a human, just one step above being dead. So this red state of consciousness could be called undead. People whose consciousness is concentrated here in the red range have the lowest capacity for the light of God that a living human can have, and therefore they tend to think only in terms of survival. They perceive life as a fight or competition, they believe resources are scarce, and so they act like parasites or vampires who take life force from others to sustain their own life. So we've got a metaphorical parasitic dynamic here, but interestingly, the physical manifestation of parasites also takes place here in the root or bowels of the human body most of the time. I know there are parasites that affect other parts of the body, but usually when we think of parasites that deplete life force from the human being, those parasites live in the bowels, in the intestines and such. And it is interesting to note that breatharians who no longer consume food no longer excrete waste. So there's nothing for a bowel parasite to feed on secondhand, and thus parasitic infections are cleared up by the pranic state. Breatharians restore their connection to God within and no longer need to extract life force from other living beings like a parasite would. So because they've forfeited the parasitic mindset, they stop having parasites physically. So parasites are simultaneously physical and spiritual in nature. The red zone is characterized by fear. Red consciousness is highly adrenalized. This is because to the dead, an adrenaline rush from fear is actually a high relative to where they're starting from. So in order to rise above the red and progress up into orange, the aspirant must overcome fear-based thinking and forfeit vampiric bloodthirst. Failure to evolve past this frequency can manifest as senseless violence, anger issues, blind rage, this is where we get the term seeing red, violent crime, gang activity, brutality and war, addiction to hard drugs, and so on. In the orange zone, the human being discovers their capacity for physical pleasure in the form of sexual gratification. This is absolutely a step up from red in that it's a bit less volatile. This is also the beginning of creative prowess. It is from this wavelength upward that a human being can create in the world and be generative. The creation associated with this wavelength in particular is procreation, or making babies, making physical, three-dimensional beings. Most people, sadly, do not rise above this wavelength in their lifetime because coming from the scarcity-based red state of very little light, this higher degree of light, concentrated in the pelvic region, can feel very overwhelming. So most people, when they feel that buildup of lust or sexual energy here, they have very little internal space to hold that much light, and so they seek to expel it through genital-based orgasms for some sort of relief of that pent-up pressure. So until the aspirant learns how to hold more light inside their body, particularly here, and draw it upward instead of expelling it down and out, back into the ground, back into a flat line, the temptation to be depleted through the sacral center will feel very strong. And this is why people resist the idea of celibacy so much. They cannot imagine that a person can have even more intensity built up in their body than what it feels like to hold an orgasm in. And I will elaborate on celibacy and lust and how to navigate those things in a future sermon. Failure to evolve past this frequency range manifests as sexual deviance, which can look like making one's sexual orientation and sexual activities their entire identity, porn and sex addiction, wanting a sexual relationship with no strings attached, meaning no emotional investment, prostituting oneself or purchasing sex from prostitutes, rapism, becoming a human sex trafficker, unconsciously reproducing, having babies by accident, and using abortion as birth control. That is just the short list. Basically, having no willful, disciplined mastery over one's sexual urges and seeking a life of compulsive depletion. What people don't understand is that the constant buildup of energy here is God's light attempting to wake you up from your dead asleep state and draw you up closer to Him. This can be a gateway up into higher realms. When you point your consciousness to God and really let yourself be satisfied by God, you will find that depleting yourself through a genital-based orgasm will no longer be as satisfying as it once was, and you will feel it as the horrific drainage of life force that it actually is. Once one has increased their capacity to hold light at this frequency range, they can evolve up into yellow. This is where things get interesting. Yellow. This is where you find the elites of the physical world. Yellow rules business, commerce, the exchange of wealth and riches, and it is right below the heart, so this means it is the pinnacle of worldly things. It's the top of the mountain, so to speak. People in the yellow realm have disciplined themselves just enough to establish something enduring in the physical world, like a business or publication. So instead of fighting for survival like they would in red, or compulsively depleting themselves like they do in orange, they have drawn energy upward enough to rise above their basic animal nature and make a comfortable throne for themselves up here. Now, this is not to say that the worldly elites are necessarily more well-behaved or less sinful than the masses they perceive as being underneath them. They have simply found a talent they can capitalize on, or they have mastered time management or team leadership, or in some way or another, They've learned how to steward the resources available to them in the material realm, and that makes life much more comfortable for them here in the physical. And please keep in mind, not everyone who flaunts wealth is actually a master of the yellow frequency. Those mind-controlled puppets we see in the media, for example, being paraded around as elites, are not wealthy as a result of their own self-mastery, but as a result of soul compromise. And this is why we are seeing now a massive exposure of celebrities and politicians who've engaged in human sex trafficking and sacrifice. They haven't even made it past here. It's important to be clear that wealth is not intrinsically evil, but although wealth can be earned through self-discipline, it is not the final stop on the soul's journey. Remember when Jesus said, "It is easier for a cord to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." This is what he meant. Failure to master this frequency can manifest as greed, hoarding wealth, a competitive spirit, commodifying everything, wanting to capitalize on everything as if money is one source of life and not God, lacking empathy for the less fortunate, feeling superior to impoverished people, only making moves with money that benefit oneself, no sense of charity, no sense of generosity, and so on. Once the aspirant can truly digest the lessons of this yellow wavelength, they can move up into green where the heart is and begin bridging heaven with earth, knowing how to be in the world but not of it. A spiritual mentor of mine once said, "Green is in the middle of the visible light spectrum because it gives as much as it receives." Considering that the heart is what connects people in relationship and also what connects heaven to earth, I agree with that statement. This is where you learn to love your neighbor as yourself. Having mastered the frequencies below, people in the green are in a position to show those still ascending glimpses of the heavenly realms above and distribute what they receive from heaven below. This is well represented by Jesus' miracle of multiplying fish and loaves out of thin air to feed the crowds. Instead of extracting resources from the worldly realm below to feed people, he received spiritual sustenance from God and made it physically manifest for those less spiritually developed who did not yet know how to do that. This is precisely what the rich man in the yellow range cannot comprehend. Since the rich man mistakes the material world as his source, sharing his resources without depleting himself is incomprehensible. But those in the green understand that it is God who provides for them, not the world. Thus, by sharing what God gives them from above with those below, they demonstrate God's generosity and cause people to look up, thus giving them a chance to become more conscious. This is what is meant by glorifying your Father in heaven. That's Matthew 5:16. Herein lies the challenge of ascending past green. When you become focused on cultivating loving relationships, it can be easy to forget that God is your source and start keeping emotional tabs on people. Failure to master this frequency can manifest as guilt trips, emotional manipulation, feeling owed by others, which begets a self-pity and martyr mentality, keeping score in relationships, holding grudges, being unforgiving of debts and trespasses. I give, you take, then you give and I take is how mortals love. It is conditional and limited love that does not actually respect free will. It is not how God loves. So once this light is integrated, the aspirant can ascend to the realm of art and expression of truth, where they begin to learn how to give without receiving. Because God is truth and light, and blue is much closer to God than the aforementioned colors, it is imperative that the aspirant learn how to discern the difference between expressing from heaven and expressing from the world. Now, although this sermon is specifically examining light and its symbolic implications on the spiritual path, recall that earlier I said our universe is comprised of light and sound. Light can occur in a vacuum, meaning it does not need a medium to carry it. This is why God is light, and light can have the qualities of both a particle and a wavelength. God being light means God exists outside of the parameters of space-time, which are necessary to the formation of waveforms. So when you take away time and space, you're left with the only thing that can exist beyond those things, which is I am. Blue rules the throat and mouth and ears, and this is the last waveform that deals in physical sounds, as we are now bordering on the physical realm and the heavenly realms. The word of God is received and expressed here, and this word can absolutely influence the physical world when applied consciously. Once arriving in the blue, the aspirant learns about truth and the expression of that truth. So in the blue range, we are dealing with artists, teachers, visionaries, spiritual leaders, people who tend to find themselves being put on a pedestal by people who are hungering and thirsting for knowledge and therefore have great influence over those who look up to them. So whereas in green we learned about reciprocal relationships, in blue we learn how to be in an imbalanced relationship where we become responsible for imparting knowledge from heaven to those on earth, and we must learn how to give to all those on earth without receiving anything from them in return. This lesson is exemplified by the trope of the artist who must make the choice between selling their soul and diluting their art for the sake of commercial success, versus expressing truth whether or not people agree with it or give them anything in return for it, like validation or money. Very few people ever find themselves in this position on a large scale, but everyone has some level of influence in some area of their lives. This dynamic of finding oneself in a position of influence happens because at this point one has increased their capacity for light, and now they literally shine in a way that gets people's attention from down here, even when they're not trying to get attention. It is imperative that the aspirant learns how to put God above all else. The moment the aspirant forgets that truth matters more than the world's approval, they risk slipping into narcissistic, controlling behaviors, like trying to police other people's thoughts and actions. The most malignant manifestation of this is the archetypal cult leader, who become so invested in the adoration they receive from their followers that they fear losing approval, and consequently they obsess over making sure that no one ever says anything negative about them. This is what I mean when I say we must learn how to give without receiving in return. If a leader becomes more concerned with approval from the group below over God's truth from above, their words become corrupted and they mislead the masses. When one fails to learn the lessons of this wavelength, it can easily devolve into narcissism and vanity, weaponized speech and idle speech, gossip, slander, and defamation, tone policing, thought-stopping rhetoric, mind control, deceptive and self-glorifying behaviors. And this is why prayer is of the utmost importance. Prayer is about talking with God and listening for God's responses, both of these being ruled by the blue frequency. So listening to God matters more than listening to the masses who are still relatively unconscious and are inclined to snuff out light. Now that the aspirant has learned how to rise above the judgments of others, they enter to purple, where the script is flipped. And now they must learn how to stop judging others and instead see things as they are. Clear vision or clairvoyance is developed in this frequency, and the soul is said to be seated in the pineal gland, which is in the center of the brain around this level. Hence, judge not lest ye be judged, and take the plank out of your own eye. It's interesting that Jesus chose a metaphor about eyes because the eyes both receive and project light. When passive, you are receiving light. When intentional, you are projecting light. So if your eye is blocked by a plank, you will not be able to either receive or project light. At this level of consciousness represented by purple, you now have enough light in you to override what you see in the material world. I learned this when I practiced gamma ray vision and manifested a gold bracelet in 1 hour. There's the video for that. So when Jesus says to remove the plank from our own eye before removing the speck from our brother's eye, he is telling us to be mindful of that which blocks our vision. Our ability to intentionally project visions into reality can actually heal people because we can envision them healed and make it true. It is a responsibility to see by faith. But if we judge others as wrong, we fail to see how our vision is blocked by our own shadow and our own remaining inner darkness. So it is a responsibility to choose to see goodness, choose to see potential realized, choose to see abundance, all for the benefit of others. This is part of our task in bringing heaven to earth. We correct the darkness of the world by filling it with light, and we fill the world with light using our eyes. This is revealed by these two verses in tandem. Matthew 5:16, in the same way, let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. And Matthew 6:22, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. So if in order to have a light that you can shine before others, you need to have good eyes, clearing out your vision is of the utmost importance. This is where psychic abilities are gained, as one needs a great deal of inner light to see the world clearly and unflinchingly, and bring light to dark, shadow-ruled places. Notice how when Jesus encountered a dead person, he did not look away in disgust or look down on them for dying. He looked straight at them and decided that they were actually asleep, and therefore could be woken up. So then he made them be awake. Or when Jesus encountered a sick person, he first assessed the state of sickness and then projected that they were healed. Jesus was so full of light that he could see where light was needed and then project that light into the darkness, thereby correcting it with his vision. He did not let the sorry state of the world tell him how to see. He was not a passive perceiver. He told the world what it should look like, and it conformed to his vision. That is what happens when you cultivate inner light and enough willpower to project it outward like a gamma ray. Problems in this frequency can manifest as cynicism, constant judgments of reality, a gloom and doom attitude about the future, a resistance to envisioning heaven on earth, an excessive focus on bad news, negativity, and the shortcomings of humanity, paranoia, a persecution complex, delusions, schizophrenia, psychosis, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and other mental plagues, short attention span, dim inner vision, limited imagination, lack of faith, and negative assumptions about God's nature. Now in white, which I've represented here with a gray pencil, because you wouldn't be able to see it if it was white, we become privy to the mysteries of spirit over matter. The saints who reach this level literally lift off the ground. They levitate, they fly, they bilocate, they teleport, they defy the laws of physics because they have cultivated enough capacity for light that they take on the qualities of light, such as being able to move swiftly and freely, and to participate in the realms above violet, which is the last color visible to a mortal. Now we're entering immortal territory. And this is why saints are often depicted with a halo around their head. They have effectively drawn that life force up towards God enough that they begin to merge with God and become luminous. This is where the light body begins to manifest, and they begin to leave this earthly plane by way of ascension. Illuminated saints can leave the ground being analogous to death states. They can ascend up and away from the ground because they have genuinely increased their capacity for higher frequencies, and this is why the freedom of flight is incompatible with the bloodthirst of the red realm. You cannot learn to fly unless you are willing to leave the ground, leave density, leave bloodshed, vampirism, parasitism, and sinfulness behind. Paradoxically, humility is crucial to ascending beyond this level, because once someone attains the power of flight, it can be easy to fall into ego traps of wanting to be worshipped like a god. To perceive flight as an achievement is to think in scarcity mode, because there's a prize to win and there can only be one winner. But flight is simply a manifestation of the embodied gnosis of freedom, and everyone is free ultimately, even those who choose not to fly. Whenever we are choosing not to fly, we are choosing that freely, with our free will, which God gave to all of us. God's love is so complete and unconditional that God allows us to believe we aren't free. That's how free we are. If not for free will, we would not be able to experience God's love. To embody light is to freely, willingly, choosingly return to the state of luminous oneness with God that we enjoyed in the Garden of Eden before we freely chose to fall into density and darkness. But to choose this is to know that even angels can fall. Luminosity and freedom does not remove the possibility of sin from us. So again, humility is key. Jonathan Edwards put it thusly: pride is the first sin that ever entered into the universe, and the last sin that is rooted out. What makes Jesus' example so powerful is that he chose to come down into the world to liberate others who were lost in the darkness. He did not just say, every man for himself, I learned to walk on water because I'm special, so I'm out of here. No. He came not to be served, but to serve. Then he told us to do the same. This is the highest calling. To learn luminosity, to learn flight, is to become responsible for sharing that light without hesitation, like the sun, giving consistently and indiscriminately. This is what it means to share the gospel, to let your light so shine before men that they may glorify God in heaven. Those who wish to remain in darkness are free to shield their eyes against the light. Do not let their rejection stop you from shining, because this isn't about you. The whole point of the light body is to shed your temporal identity, the identity locked in time-space, locked in a narrative, and return to God in the forever Eden of the eternal present moment of I am. Let your light remind people who God is. Do not shine for your glory, but for God's. For even the sun was created by the Creator. In all things, put God first. God is your creator. God is your source. And you may have noticed that the common thread as we reviewed every color on the Ascension path was God is your source. In red, we learned blood is not your source of nourishment. In orange, we learned sex is not your source of fulfillment. In yellow, we learned money is not your source of provision. In green, we learned relationships are not your source of love. In blue and purple, we learned the world is not your source of truth. And in white, we learned temporal self is not your source of freedom. In all things, God is your source. So keep your focus on God at all times, in all things, and everything else will be added unto you.